Melania Trump had spent years in the public eye, surrounded by controversy, speculation, and narratives she never tried to control. To the media, she was an enigma, silent when they expected outrage, composed when they sought drama. But tonight was different. Tonight, she was sitting across from Sarah Matthews, one of the most relentless interviewers on television, a woman determined to break through the mystery and expose the truth. The cameras were rolling, the stage was set, and millions were watching, waiting to see if Melania would finally stumble, if the cracks would show, if the woman so often dismissed as distant and passive would finally be forced to defend herself. What they didn't expect was for her to do something far more powerful. Without raising her voice, without engaging in the theatrics of political combat, she would turn the tables in a way no one saw. By the end of the night, it wouldn't be Melania on the defensive, it would be the media itself. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. The studio lights cast a cold, artificial glow over the sleek, polished table. The CNN logo shone in the background, reflecting off the glossy surface like an ever-present reminder of the network's authority. A low murmur from the audience faded into silence as the camera slowly zoomed in on the two women seated across from each other. Sarah Matthews, the sharp-featured journalist known for her ruthless questioning, tilted her head slightly, a tight-lipped smile forming as she shuffled the notes in front of her. Opposite her, composed and unshaken, sat Melania Trump. Dressed in an immaculate, cream-colored ensemble, her posture was perfect, her hands gently resting on her lap, her expression unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable. Tonight, we have a very special guest, a woman who has been at the center of American politics for years but has remained, to many, a mystery. Sarah's voice was smooth, deliberate, laced with the calculated friendliness of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Melania Trump, the former First Lady of the United States, the wife of one of the most controversial presidents in history, and some would say the silent enigma of the Trump administration. She let the words hang in the air, her eyes scanning Melania's face for any flicker of reaction. Nothing. The former First Lady simply offered a small, polite nod. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her smile widening as if she were addressing an old friend. Let's start with something simple. You've been out of the public eye for a while now. What made you decide to sit down for this interview today? For a moment, silence filled the space between them. Melania's gaze was calm, assessing. She didn't rush to answer, didn't show even the slightest sign of nervousness. When she finally spoke, her voice was smooth, measured, carrying the quiet authority that had always set her apart. "Because people like you," she said evenly, "think they know who I am." A subtle shift in Sarah's demeanor. The words had landed, not aggressively, not defensively, but with a weight that couldn't be ignored. She chuckled softly, tilting her head. "And do we know who Melania Trump really is?" Melania held her gaze for a moment longer before responding. "No," she said simply. The answer was brief, but it had an impact. A ripple of intrigue passed through the audience. Sarah pressed on. "Then let's change that tonight. Over the years, there's been so much speculation about you, your role, your opinions, your silence. Some have even called you complicit in your husband's actions. Others say you were trapped. What do you say to those people?" Melania blinked slowly, as if considering whether the question was even worth answering. Then she leaned forward ever so slightly, just enough to make it clear that she wasn't intimidated. "I say," she began, her accent adding a quiet sharpness to her words, "that they never listened." Sarah arched a brow, pretending not to be fazed. "Never listened?" she echoed, inviting her to continue. A pause. Then, for the first time, Melania let the faintest hint of a smile touch her lips. "They only heard what they wanted to hear," she said. Sarah's grip on her notes tightened slightly. The interview had barely started, but something in the air had shifted. This wasn't going to be the easy, one-sided takedown she had expected. The studio was a masterpiece of controlled atmosphere. cool-toned, sleek, and designed to give the illusion of impartiality. Every detail was intentional, from the way the overhead lights reflected off the glass table to the strategically positioned cameras capturing every micro-expression. The audience sat in hushed anticipation, their faces half-lit by the glow of the massive screen behind Sarah Matthews, where carefully selected images of Melania Trump's past flickered in slow succession. Official portraits from the White House, brief moments at international events, the occasional candid shot where she seemed distant, unreadable. The narrative was being set before a single question was even asked. Sarah exuded the confidence of someone who believed they were in control. Dressed in a tailored navy suit that emphasized both authority and modernity, she embodied the aggressive elegance that made her one of the most feared interviewers in political media. She had built her reputation on being relentless, on pressing, cornering, exposing. This was her battlefield, and she had spent years dismantling public figures who underestimated her. She wasn't just here to ask questions, she was here to shape the conversation, to dictate its rhythm, to make sure the audience saw the version of the story she wanted them to see. Opposite her, Melania sat with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that power did not come from excess movement. Her hands, delicately manicured, rested gently on her lap, and her posture remained impeccable, her shoulders pulled back in quiet defiance of the implied scrutiny. There was no fidgeting, no telltale signs of discomfort. If she was nervous, she didn't show it. She had spent years in the eye of the storm, years being analyzed, dissected, judged by people who had never spoken a word to her. And yet here she was, the perfect image of poise, unshaken, unmoved. Sarah studied her for a moment, as if trying to decipher something that had eluded so many before her. "I have to say, Melania," she began, her voice coated in a thin layer of politeness, "it's not every day that we get to hear from you directly. You've always been something of a mystery, even as First Lady. People have speculated for years about what you really think, what you really believe. Tonight, maybe we can change that." Melania met her gaze with an unreadable expression. "People speculate because they do not listen," she said simply. Sarah let out a soft chuckle, as if amused by the response. "You mean they don't listen or they don't hear what they expect to?" Melania tilted her head slightly, an almost imperceptible movement, but one that shifted the energy in the room. "Does it matter?" A murmur rippled through the audience. It wasn't a deflection. It wasn't avoidance. It was something else. Something that suggested Melania wasn't here to play into Sarah's framing of the conversation. The journalist's smile didn't falter, but something in her posture changed. A slight tightening in the way she held herself. She wasn't used to guests who didn't take the bait so easily. She flipped through her notes, pretending to consider her next move, though she had rehearsed this 100 times in her head. "Let's go back a little," she said. "Your time in the White House, people often described you as distant, sometimes even reluctant in your role. There was always this perception that you didn't want to be there, that perhaps you were trapped." Melania didn't react, didn't shift in her seat or offer even the slightest indication that she found the question surprising. She simply let Sarah's words hang in the air for a moment, as if weighing them, dissecting them piece by piece before choosing whether they were even worth addressing. Then, with a slow inhale, she finally spoke. "People say many things." Sarah raised an eyebrow, waiting, expecting more. "And?" Melania let a small pause settle between them. "That does not make them true." The sharpness of the response cut through the air like a blade. Sarah's expression barely flickered, but there was a moment, so brief it could have been imagined, where something in her eyes shifted. She was beginning to understand what was happening here. This was not going to be the interview she had expected. She adjusted her posture, leaning in just a fraction, signaling to the audience that she was about to push harder. "Then let's talk about what is true. You have always been seen as someone who chooses silence over confrontation. Some would say that's diplomacy, others might call it avoidance. But at the end of the day, you were standing next to the most controversial president in modern history. Doesn't the public deserve to know what you really thought about it all?" Melania remained still. "And who decides what they deserve to know?" Sarah's lips parted slightly, caught off guard by the question. This wasn't a simple rebuttal, it was a shift in control, a reminder that the premise of the conversation itself was not as stable as Sarah had intended. The audience was no longer just watching an interview, they were watching a game unfold. A slow, deliberate battle of perception and power, and for the first time that night, Sarah Matthews was beginning to wonder if she had underestimated her opponent. The air in the studio had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A shift in weight, a crackle of something unspoken. Sarah Matthews knew it, could feel it in the way the audience leaned in just a little more, in the way the silence between words stretched a fraction longer than necessary. This was the moment where the real interview began, where the gloves came off, where the slow dance of pleasantries gave way to sharp edges. She had spent years perfecting this technique. Start light, lure them in, make them feel at ease, then press. Apply pressure, corner them before they even realized what's happening. And yet, sitting across from Melania Trump, she felt something she rarely felt in these situations: resistance. Not the usual kind, not the defensive, scrambling kind that most politicians and public figures exhibited when the questions got uncomfortable. No, this was something else entirely. An immovable calm, a refusal to play the game the way it was expected to be played. Sarah shifted in her seat, adjusting the stack of notes in front of her, even though she knew exactly what was on them. "Let's talk about your role in the White House," she said, her voice still smooth, controlled. "For 4 years, you were the First Lady of the United States, and yet many would argue that you were one of the least visible First Ladies in modern history. You didn't do as many interviews, you didn't engage with the media the way your predecessors did. Some even described you as an unwilling participant." Melania didn't flinch. She blinked once, slowly, as if giving Sarah a moment to reconsider the angle she was taking. "An unwilling participant," she echoed, her tone devoid of emotion but not of meaning. Sarah nodded, leaning forward slightly. "Yes, some say you never wanted to be First Lady, that you resented the position, that you only endured it because you had no choice. They point to the footage from the inauguration, the times you pulled your hand away from your husband, the moments when you looked." She paused just long enough to make it intentional, miserable. A murmur ran through the audience, low but present. It was the kind of statement designed to provoke, to push, to extract a reaction. Sarah waited, eyes locked on Melania's face, watching for the flicker of discomfort, the shift in body language, the telltale sign that she had struck a nerve. But Melania simply remained as she was, her expression smooth, her posture untouched. She inhaled lightly, exhaled even softer, then spoke. People see what they want to see. It wasn't a deflection, it wasn't an evasion, it was something worse. It was an answer that turned the accusation into a question. Sarah narrowed her eyes slightly, recalibrating. "So, you're saying that all of those moments, every time the cameras caught you looking unhappy, every time you seemed distant, none of that was real? None of that reflected how you actually felt?" Melania tilted her head just a fraction, the kind of movement that normally wouldn't mean anything, but in this setting, in this precise moment, it carried weight. "You assume that because you see a second, you know the story." Sarah let out a small, calculated chuckle, shaking her head slightly, as if indulging a child's naivete. "Melania, with all due respect, we're not talking about just a second. We're talking about years of footage, years of moments where you seemed detached, where you seemed to be..." Another intentional pause, another rhetorical trap. "Somewhere else entirely." Melania let the words settle, let them breathe. The silence she left behind them was not empty. It was filled with something heavy, something deliberate. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but her words had the sharpness of glass. "You say seemed. You say looked like. You are not asking me about my experience. You are telling me what you believe it was." The audience shifted. Sarah didn't miss it. A subtle shift in weight, a low whisper in the back of the studio, the kind of reaction that signaled a change in momentum. She pressed forward. Then tell us, if everyone was wrong, if the world misread you, what was the truth? What was it really like being First Lady to one of the most controversial presidents in history? Melanie held her gaze, unblinking. It was my life. The simplicity of the answer made Sarah's fingers tighten slightly around her notes. That's not an answer. It is, Melania countered, her voice still impossibly steady. You want me to say what fits your story. You want me to say I was trapped or unhappy or that I regret it. But my life is not a script for you to edit. Sarah exhaled through her nose, smiling thinly, not willing to concede an inch. Fair enough. Let's put it another way. Throughout your time in the White House, you remained mostly silent on your husband's policies, on immigration, on the media, on race. People expected you to speak out, to take a stand, to show that you had your own voice. But you didn't. You stayed silent. Why? Melania let the question settle for a moment before responding. Because I know the difference between speaking and being heard. The audience murmured again, louder this time. It was a rare thing, seeing someone turn an interview into something else entirely, seeing someone refuse to be led down the path so carefully laid for them. Sarah felt the control slipping, just a little, just enough for her to notice. She wasn't losing, not yet, but she wasn't winning either. And that was a problem. Sarah felt it now, the shift, the slight unraveling of the control she was so used to wielding. This was supposed to be her moment, the part of the interview where she turned up the heat, where the guest squirmed, hesitated, stumbled over their words. But Melania wasn't playing along. She wasn't dodging, wasn't reacting, wasn't even showing the slightest sign of discomfort. She was absorbing every question, every accusation, and then handing them back with the kind of deliberate precision that turned the scrutiny onto the one asking. Sarah wasn't used to this. Most people, when pressed hard enough, cracked. Melania was doing something different. She was letting Sarah do all the pressing, all the pushing, all the performing. And in doing so, she was making it clear who really had control. Sarah adjusted her posture, her shoulders tightening as she glanced at her notes. There was no backing down, not yet. You say you know the difference between speaking and being heard, she repeated, keeping her voice steady, controlled. But when you were First Lady, there were moments when people were practically begging to hear from you, when families were being separated at the border, when your husband's rhetoric was dividing the country, when women were marching in the streets. They weren't just waiting for Donald Trump to speak. They were waiting for you. And you said nothing. Melania held her gaze, unmoving. That is not true. Sarah leaned forward. What part isn't true? You say I said nothing, Melania replied. I said plenty. You just chose not to listen. The air in the studio grew denser. Sarah let out a small breath through her nose, the type meant to convey patience, though there was something sharper beneath it. All right, let's be specific. The "I really don't care, do you" jacket. You wore that knowing the media would see it. You wore it while visiting children who had been separated from their parents. If that wasn't a message, then what was it? Melania blinked, slow and deliberate. It was a message, she said finally. Sarah's lips parted slightly, as if caught off guard by the simplicity of the response. She had expected denial, excuses, deflection. She hadn't expected this. Then explain it. Melania didn't hesitate. It was a message to people like you. A low murmur rippled through the audience, the kind that signaled something was happening, something shifting. Sarah kept her expression even, but inside she could feel the tension twisting. People like me, she repeated, as if confirming she had heard correctly. Yes, Melania said, her tone as smooth as ever. People who twist stories, people who create controversy where there is none, people who pretend to care about the truth but only care about the narrative they can control. Sarah stiffened, just slightly, just enough that the cameras might not catch it, but Melania did. The First Lady didn't need to raise her voice or speak quickly. The weight of her words came from their precision, from their steadiness, from the way she never once looked away. So you're saying the media was the real problem? I am saying that the media does not like when someone refuses to play their game, Melania answered. They called me silent, but they never listened when I spoke. They called me cold, but they never saw the work I did. They called me complicit, but they never asked why I stayed. They wrote the story for me, and when I did not read the script, they became angry." Sarah exhaled sharply, shaking her head slightly, as if brushing off the response. "Melania, the press didn't invent those images of you standing next to your husband with a blank expression. They didn't create the moments when you pulled your hand away. They didn't make up the fact that you were largely absent from the biggest movements of the past decade. Those are real moments. Those happened." Melania tilted her head slightly, watching Sarah like a chess player watches an opponent attempting a move they already anticipated. "And what should I have done?" Sarah hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "You tell me," Melania continued, her voice as soft as it was firm. "Should I have stood on a stage and shouted what you wanted to hear? Should I have held up a sign and joined the movements you approved of? Should I have become what you expected instead of who I am?" Sarah's grip on her pen tightened. The air in the room was shifting again, and she could feel it. The audience wasn't just listening anymore. They were watching her now, waiting to see what she would do next. She wasn't sure she liked that feeling. "You're making this about the media," Sarah said, her voice careful, deliberate. "But this isn't about the press. This is about accountability. As First Lady, you had a platform, a voice, and you used it sparingly. Some would argue that silence in the face of controversy is the same as complicity." Melania leaned forward, her first real movement of the night. The air in the studio went still, and I would argue that shouting does not make someone right. Sarah opened her mouth, but for the first time, no words came immediately. It wasn't just an answer, it was a statement that left no room for rebuttal. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she was the one leading this conversation anymore. The silence stretched between them, thick and charged, as if the very air in the studio had solidified. Sarah Matthews was good at this, at controlling the flow of conversation, at keeping the pressure exactly where she wanted it, at ensuring that the person sitting across from her felt the weight of her questions pressing down like an iron hand. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar. A shift, a resistance she couldn't break. Melania Trump was not scrambling, she was not flustered, she was not playing into the carefully constructed traps laid before her. She was simply there, unshaken, unmoved, waiting. Sarah couldn't let this slip. She forced a thin smile, her fingers pressing lightly against the table. "So, let's get this straight," she said, her voice even, steady, though there was an edge to it now. "You're saying that silence is a form of strength? That choosing not to engage with the issues dividing this country was some kind of calculated wisdom?" Melania didn't blink. "I am saying that not everything needs to be shouted to be understood." Sarah exhaled softly, shaking her head as if in disbelief. "All right," she said, flipping a page in her notes, even though she didn't need to look at them. "Let's talk about something you did say then. Something you did do. Be best. Your initiative focused on online bullying and children's well-being, and yet," she let out a small, almost amused breath, "you were married to a man who was arguably one of the most aggressive voices on social media. How do you reconcile that? How do you stand in front of the American people and say that cyberbullying is unacceptable while sharing a life with someone who made a career out of it?" The audience stirred, sensing the sharpness of the question, the way it cut through the air like a knife. This was it. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. The inconsistency, the hypocrisy, the question that would finally force Melania to stumble. But Melania didn't stumble. She didn't shift in her seat, didn't glance away, didn't offer the awkward, hesitant response that so many others would have. Instead, she tilted her head just slightly, considering Sarah the way one might consider a chessboard. Then, in a voice so calm it almost felt unnatural in the heat of the moment, she asked, "Do you want to talk about hypocrisy, Sarah?" The words landed like a stone dropping into still water. A single impact, but the ripples spread fast. Sarah's smile faltered for half a second, so brief it was almost imperceptible. "Almost. You say my initiative was hypocritical because of my husband," Melania continued, her voice unhurried, measured, but carrying a weight that seemed to press down on the room itself. But let me ask you, how many people sitting in this studio right now, how many people watching at home, have told their children to be kind while spreading hate on the internet? How many journalists sitting in this building have published headlines designed to humiliate, to attack, to destroy reputations? How many media companies profit from outrage, from tearing people apart, from pushing narratives they know will divide people instead of bringing them together? The murmur in the audience was louder now. Sarah could feel it. This wasn't just a response. It was a shift in control. The direction of the conversation had turned, and she had not been the one to turn it. Melania leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked onto Sarah's with an intensity that had been absent before. You call me a hypocrite because of my husband, but tell me, Sarah, how many times has your network run stories designed to bully, to shame, to silence people who think differently? How many times have you sat in that chair and used your voice to attack rather than to understand? Sarah inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening against her papers. This isn't about me, she said quickly, her voice controlled but slightly thinner than before. Of course not, Melania said, her tone almost amused, though there was no humor in her eyes. It never is it? For the first time that night, Sarah Matthews had nothing to say. The audience wasn't just watching an interview anymore, they were watching a balance of power shift in real time, and they weren't sure they had expected it to shift this way. The weight of the moment was unmistakable. The air in the studio felt heavier now, thick with the kind of charged silence that only came when something undeniable had just been said. Sarah Matthews sat still, her grip tightening ever so slightly around the papers in front of her. Her usual rhythm, the effortless flow of control she had mastered in interviews like this, had been broken. It wasn't just that Melania had pushed back, it was the way she had done it, not with anger, not with defensiveness, not with the frantic scrambling of someone desperate to justify themselves. No, she had done it with patience, with precision, with a quiet confidence that made every word land harder. And the worst part? The audience wasn't just watching Sarah anymore. They were watching Melania. Sarah forced a small, composed smile, the kind meant to mask frustration. You're saying the media is the real problem here, she said carefully, regaining just enough of her usual control to keep her voice steady. That the criticism you faced wasn't about your actions, but about the way the press decided to frame them. Is that right? Melania regarded her for a moment, then, with the same unshaken calm that had carried her through the entire interview, she answered, I'm saying that people believe what they are told to believe. The audience murmured again, louder this time. The shift was happening in real time. Sarah could feel it. This was not the way the interview was supposed to go. She had spent years dissecting public figures, pushing them into the uncomfortable corners where they would either crack or attempt to claw their way out in ways that only made them look worse. But Melania had done neither. She had simply refused to engage in the fight Sarah had laid out for her, and in doing so, she had flipped the power dynamic entirely. Sarah pushed forward, trying to salvage what she could. But Melania, public perception isn't manufactured out of thin air. People saw the way you carried yourself, the choices you made, the things you did, and didn't say. It wasn't just the press that shaped how people saw you. It was you. Melania tilted her head slightly, watching Sarah the way one might watch a performer who had begun to lose confidence in their own act. You say people saw me, she said, her voice as smooth as ever. But did they? Or did they see only what they wanted to see? Sarah exhaled through her nose, sensing that every road she took was leading her back to the same dead end. All right, she said, shifting her approach. Let's talk about now. You're no longer First Lady. You don't have to be silent anymore. So tell us, who is the real Melania Trump? Melania considered her for a long moment. The pause stretched just long enough to make the audience lean in, to make the anticipation feel almost unbearable. Then, finally, she answered, I am exactly who I have always been. Sarah blinked, waiting for more. But there was no more. That was it. That was the answer, simple, definitive, and impossible to twist. The room was still. The cameras rolled, capturing every detail. The poised stillness of Melania, the measured control of her expression, the way Sarah's shoulders had tensed ever so slightly as she realized there was nothing left to grab onto. The conversation was over. Not because Melania had walked away, not because she had refused to engage, but because she had won. Sarah cleared her throat, masking her frustration with a professional smile. "Well," she said, her voice lighter than before, though the edge of tension hadn't fully left it. "I think that's all the time we have for tonight. Melania Trump, thank you for being here." Melania nodded once, a small graceful movement. "Thank you." The audience clapped, some because it was expected, others because they had just witnessed something they hadn't anticipated. Sarah turned to the camera, delivering the usual closing remarks, but something had shifted in her voice. The power she had started this interview with was no longer there. It had been taken, quietly, subtly, without a single raised voice or overt confrontation. Melania hadn't needed to fight. She had simply refused to lose. And as the cameras faded to black, as the network cut to commercial, the conversations had already begun. Not about what Sarah had revealed, but about what she had failed to control. Within minutes of the interview ending, the internet was on fire. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, every platform was flooded with clips, reaction videos, and furious debates dissecting every moment of what had just unfolded on live television. Melania Strikes Back wasn't just trending, it was dominating, outpacing political news, celebrity gossip, and even major global events. The conversation wasn't about what Sarah Matthews had exposed, it was about what she had failed to control. The woman she had expected to pin down had slipped right through her fingers, leaving the media world scrambling to regain footing. Clips of Melania's sharpest responses spread like wildfire, with one in particular being looped, remixed, and analyzed frame by frame. "Do you want to talk about hypocrisy, Sarah?" It wasn't shouted. It wasn't said in anger. It was delivered with the kind of quiet, surgical precision that made it all the more devastating. The moment Sarah blinked, hesitated, just for a second, was seized upon by thousands of social media users who knew exactly what they had witnessed. A shift in power, an unraveling of control, a journalist who, for once, didn't have the upper hand. Conservative media was quick to capitalize, flooding headlines with phrases like "Melania Trump destroys CNN host," "Flawless victory in live interview," and "How Melania outsmarted the media without raising her voice." On Fox News, the footage played on a loop, with pundits calling it a masterclass in composure. Even those who had long dismissed Melania as a passive figure in Trump's political world were now forced to reconsider. The Daily Wire ran an article titled, "Underestimated for Years, Melania Just Showed Why That Was a Mistake." Liberal outlets scrambled to reframe the narrative. CNN's initial headline, "Melania Trump Dodges Tough Questions on Her Past," was met with ridicule online as users flooded the replies with direct quotes from the interview proving otherwise. The Washington Post attempted a different angle. Melania's masterclass in deflection, did we learn anything new? But it was too late. The internet had already decided that it wasn't Melania who had been exposed that night, it was the media. Reaction channels on YouTube uploaded breakdowns of the interview within hours. Some approached it from a political perspective, analyzing how Melania had managed to flip the script on a seasoned journalist. Others focused on the body language, the subtle cues, the way Sarah Matthews had started the interview with controlled dominance and ended it visibly frustrated, her carefully rehearsed attacks rendered ineffective. TikTok was flooded with edits set to dramatic music, slow zoom-ins on Sarah's face in the moment she realized the conversation had slipped out of her hands. The top comment on most videos was always the same: "When the script stops working." The meme factory had gone into overdrive. Screenshots of Sarah's expression, frozen in mid-reaction, were plastered across Twitter with captions like, "That moment when you realize she's not playing your game," and "POV, you thought it would be an easy takedown." Even mainstream figures who typically avoided politics weighed in. Comedians, influencers, and even athletes retweeted clips with captions like, "Melania just hit the media with a reverse Uno card." And yet, despite the chaos unfolding across every corner of the internet, one person remained entirely silent: Melania Trump. No tweets, no statements, no clarifications. While the world argued over what her performance meant, she simply vanished back into the quiet, detached life she had always preferred. No victory lap, no need to reinforce what had already been cemented in the public's mind. That, more than anything, made the moment even more powerful. For years, people had accused her of being absent, of being nothing more than a passive observer to the political storm surrounding her. But in one single interview, she had done what few in media, politics, or entertainment had ever managed. She had seized control without ever appearing to try. She had let others argue, let others interpret, let others do the work for her. And as the debates raged on, as networks scrambled to salvage their coverage, as social media fought over whether she had been brilliant or just lucky, one truth remained. Melania didn't need to respond. She had already won.